Hey folks, the Comics Kid 2099 here. Last week I mentioned that I am going to be reading and reviewing every volume of Wolverine and the X-Men. And last week I read and reviewed volume 1, and today I'm taking a little bit of a hiatus and I am reviewing Wolverine and the X-Men, Alpha and Omega. This is written by Brian Wood and it's drawn by two artists whose names I have never heard before, Rowan Bosky and Dan Brown. Basically the premise of this book is you've got Quentin Quire, who is a student at Wolverine's school that he formed in volume 1 of this series. That's Quentin right there, if you can see him. And he basically is angry at Wolverine. He thinks that Wolverine has humiliated him, and so he intends to get revenge on Wolverine. And what he does, Wolverine in armor, that's this girl right here, they are sparring in the front yard of the school, and Quentin sees them, and so he takes their minds and puts their minds into his own mind, where he is running this mental simulation. Basically, this really advanced psychic danger room scenario. And basically, he's doing this just to get back at Wolverine. He doesn't have any beef against Armor, because she was just there fighting Wolverine, practicing fighting, and so he just includes her in this so that she doesn't go and tell someone what happened to Wolverine, and then he would get found out. And that's basically the premise of this book. It's a 5-issue miniseries, and I will say right off the bat, if you are interested in reading Jason Aaron's run on Wolverine and the X-Men, you probably don't have to read this. This is basically just a side story, and the only reason that it is billed as a Wolverine and the X-Men story is because Schism had just happened, and so the X-Men were split off into two different groups, and this particular story is set at the Wolverine school. And so it's being billed as a Wolverine and the X-Men story, but the ongoing story that Jason Aaron is dealing with in his run on Wolverine and the X-Men, this story doesn't really have any bearing on that. And I feel like that's okay. I don't have to have a story that has huge ramifications on the Marvel Universe for years to come. Most of the time, what I want when I'm reading a story is just a story that is self-contained and is kind of secluded and away, and I can enjoy it by itself. And I think for the most part, that is what this story does, and I think it very much succeeds at that. I would say when I first started reading this, my one complaint was that I felt like they were regressing Quentin Quire's character a little bit, because I didn't mention this, I don't think I mentioned this in my review for Wolverine and the X-Men Volume 1, but in Volume 1, Quentin Quire actually saves the school, and nobody knows that he saves the school. And we get this look into his character where he's a badmouth, he's a punk, he's kind of the bad boy, and he doesn't really get along with anybody, and we find out that deep down he's a good person, and he's just lonely. And I mentioned in my review of Volume 1 that I was really amazed that Jason Aaron was able to be consistent with the character that Grant Morrison had introduced in New X-Men. Quentin Quire was introduced in that run. He was able to be consistent with that characterization while also tweaking the character just enough so that he could be used as a good guy in Wolverine and the X-Men. And I think that Brian Wood is able to take that character and also do enough with it and make it so that he still works as the antagonist of this book, even though we are really getting into his head a lot and we're finding out a lot about him, and I think that really works. Like I say, he is the antagonist of this book. He is the one who kind of ignites the story by taking action against Wolverine and Armor, and then that kind of throws things into chaos a little bit across the school. I won't really get into what all happens there. And then throughout the story, basically, we find out that Quentin has no friends. And in Grant Morrison's New X-Men, he did have a group of friends who kind of helped him inside a riot, but you could take that to mean that he used his telepathy to basically force them to be his friends. And here, he doesn't have any friends at all. There's a few people who kind of try and make the effort, but again, he's putting up this facade of being just a jerk to everybody. Deep down, he's lonely and he's an okay person, but you almost get the feeling that he doesn't really know how to be friends back. He doesn't have any friends. People are trying to be friends with him, but he doesn't really know how to be friends towards them. And so, even though he's being a real jerk and he's risking the life of Armor and Wolverine in the story, you still come to feel sorry for him a great deal. And so I definitely feel like, at first I was a little unsure about it. I was like, okay, after Quentin Quire just saved the school in Volume 1, now you guys are having him do this thing that really makes him appear to be very morally ambiguous. By the end of the story, I was okay with it. I felt like it worked. I felt like it was a very good use of the character of Quentin Quire, and I thought it was, I just thought that was really good use of his character. There were a few things I did not like. Number one, Rachel Summers plays way too big of a part in this story. And I should go on and mention that I am not a fan of Rachel Summers. I have very rarely liked the character. I did not like her when she was brought into the main X-Men title back in the 80s. I did like her when Chris Claremont was using her in Excalibur later on. This was a few years after he got rid of her, around the time of the Mutant Massacre. I did like her in Excalibur, and then she showed up again in the 2000s. I didn't really care for her then. And in this book, she is, after Wolverine, she's basically the main teacher at the school. And it was really weird because in Volume 1, we saw her in the book, but she did not have a very large role to play. Mainly, after Wolverine, you had Beast and Kitty Pryde. Those were kind of the two main teachers at the school after Wolverine. And those two are nowhere to be seen in this book. But Rachel Summers, she's like the main teacher outside of Wolverine, and if Wolverine goes on a psychotic rampage and can't be found, then Rachel Summers is like the only teacher at the school, and everything is just falling apart without her giving orders, and I didn't really like that. Then again, I myself, I'm not a Rachel Summers fan, but also, I really don't feel like she added that much to the story. Basically, she's the one here, her entire purpose in this book is to kind of just give Quentin Quire a hard time and say like, hey, listen, I don't like you, you don't like me, but you should go to class. And that's basically the role that she plays in this book. I really didn't feel like she added anything. In a lot of ways, I think that the reason that she was here was to pad out the story. You've got Wolverine and Armor, they're in this illusion, if you will, and then when you're not doing stuff with them, you're doing stuff with Quentin, and when you're not doing stuff with either of them, then you need to do something to kind of make this story last a little bit longer. So you've got Rachel Summers kind of trying to figure out what's going on, and ultimately she does figure out who's responsible. I don't really know how she figures it out, but she does. But basically, I think you could remove all of her scenes and the story would read just fine. I don't think that she was needed in this story at all. And that kind of leads me to my other complaint. This is a 5-issue miniseries. I don't think it needed to be that long. This probably could have been a 4-issue miniseries and it would have worked just fine. Basically, there's a couple of issues here where not a whole lot happens. I think by the end of issue 1, Quentin already has Wolverine and Armor in their little psychic danger room scenario type thing, and then by the end of issue 2, not a whole lot has changed. They're still in their psychic danger room scenario. The school is still kind of sort of on its way to going into chaos because the headmaster is missing, but not a whole lot has really changed from issue 1 to issue 2. So I think they could have combined those two issues, and then in issues 3, 4, and 5, things do start to change, but combine those first two issues, and I think you could have done a 4-issue miniseries, and this story still would have told just fine. The only reason that I think that they stretched it out to 5 issues was so that we could really get into the head of Quentin Quire, and I think they do a really good job of showing us this kind of character. Now, at the first half of the book, I was able to tell, hey, this is a kid who doesn't really have a whole lot of friends, because we would see at some point he's talking to himself because he's trying to maintain this illusion that Armor and Wolverine are in, and then you would see some kids in the background kind of giggling under their breath and pointing at him. You could see that he was not the popular kid at school that he maybe thinks that he is. You could definitely see that he isn't as awesome as he thinks he is. And then the book, towards the end, it kind of just blatantly points out, hey, I'm Quentin Quire, I don't have any friends. He mentions that at one point to Armor. He says he doesn't really have any friends. I didn't really need them to overtly say that he doesn't have friends, since it was obvious to me from the art. We didn't need the story to go out of its way to mention that. But I think the only reason that the story slows down enough so that it can be 5 issues instead of 4 is so that we can really get into the head of this character. And I'm willing to give it a pass for that, because I think it does do a really good job of showing us this character. And that's about all I have to say. This was a fun story. It was, like I say, if you just want to read what's going on in Jason Aaron's Wolverine and the X-Men, as far as I know, you really don't have to read this. This is just a little diversion that uses some of the same characters at the school, but it's not really part of that ongoing storyline. But I was okay with that. I think that it was good the way that it did what it did. I would have been more upset if this had been a major part of Jason Aaron's run, but it would have been this side miniseries that you have to read in order to understand what's going on in Jason Aaron's run. I would have been more upset if it had done that. So I would recommend this story, especially if you've been reading X-Men recently and you want to kind of get to know some of these newer characters who weren't around, say, in the 1990s when you watched the X-Men cartoon. You want to get to know some of these newer characters. This would be a good place to start. You can really get to know Armor and Quentin especially. Those two are really at the forefront here. And then there's a few other newer characters that are kind of featured here, like Brew, and a little bit you've got Bling. She's featured here just a little bit, but those characters aren't like heavily featured. But if you really want to get to know some of these newer characters, this would be a great place to start. So I recommend this story. I hope that you guys liked this video. If you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And I will be back tomorrow with a different kind of video. So until then, I will see you guys later. Have a great rest of the day.